Well, good morning. Once again, I'm pleased to lead this panel here this morning, and we have a great panel to my right, which I'll introduce here shortly. This could be the best of the three panels that I've been on, just because DoD budget might actually happen. I'm crossing my fingers there. And national defense seems to be have a momentum here in the recent years. So this is good news, I think, and there's plenty to talk about today. Our mission today is multi-domain maneuver, and of course the panel we have assembled here to my right are the right people to talk about that. I want to give a shout out to our Huntsville audience. I understand friends and colleagues there have joined us today on the virtual side, and so I'm glad to have the Huntsville audience. They have much to do with the business we'll be talking about today. We have a little bit different in format that we've done in the past, and we're going to go right into questions and answers. So we're going to have, if time allows, we're going to have about 70 minutes for your questions and answers. So hopefully you have them already written out, or you're working on that right now. I have a few starter kits here, but we're going to jump right in and start on the questions. Let me introduce the panel here. Of course, our CG of United States Army Aviation Center and Fort Rucker, we all know real well. To his right, the United States Army Maneuver Center, Center of Excellence. Commander, we've met today already. To his right is Major General J.D. Thurman, who all of us know, and he has a lot to say about many topics, and most of which he has a lot of knowledge about. And to his right is to his right is Lieutenant General Kevin Mangum, and our Special Operations expert. And finally, on the end of the line there is Colonel Yi Se from the Director of the Fire Center of Excellence. So we have the right players today to talk about multi-domain maneuver. And so with that, let's begin our question here, period. And if you have questions in the audience right now, or anybody that for questions, please pass them forward. If not, I'll start off with my first question here. Since the timeless principle of maneuver remains a key component of how the Army campaigns with multi-domain operations, what are the distinctions between how the Army has traditionally conducted combined arms maneuver, and how will it need to conduct multi-domain maneuver in the future? I want to go to the Maneuver Center Commander here first and get your comments, sir, on that.
How did I know I was going to be first on this one? Well, to put it in simplified terms in the combined arms maneuver, I think, within all domains, there may have been a point before we shifted into MDO where they operated within their own swim lane. But it's very clear that operations within all the domains now are not just simultaneous, but they're integrated together and complement each other and integrated together both in non-lethal operations and effects and lethal operations and effects as well. My battle buddy Bill Gayler talked to it, and I don't want to take too much stage time on this earlier, but the necessity of standoff is probably pretty clear that anything we're going to fight in the future is going to be an away game. So the standoff is important to both the entry into an AOR, the necessity for us to work jointly with the Marines, Air Force, Navy, and others as well. So not only within all those domains complement each other, they're integrated well, and Bill talked to it also in his points. And with that, I'll share some more stage time with my battle buddies. Over.
So when you look at, physically how you fight, I would tell you, first off, our current capabilities in all of our formations today is certainly superb, and arguably we are certainly ready to fight tonight. But when you start taking into account technology and how the world has changed a little bit, that we're in constant competition always. And it's outlined pretty clearly in the National Defense Strategy of that continuum of competition that could rise to conflict and back to competition, and the effect of technology on not only that competition but on fighting itself makes you have to kind of account for, and some of the tenets are still viable. You know, you still want to integrate and synchronize effects of things, but now we're doing it over so many different more domains at one time, which is kind of what led multi-domain operations, that kind of initial thought of, hey, it's different in the future than it has been in the past, because of that added layer of cyber that's constantly in competition. You can see it right now in the news today, where cyber actors are influencing things in competition inside of our nation now. But we've got to understand how and how best to deal with it in that competition phase. But if it escalates to conflict, we also have to account for that technology in the cyber and EW world, because it will be a component of a future fight as well.
If I can pile onto that, you know, the Army operating concept, win in a complex world, is the bumper sticker. And the complexity is what's driven us to this multi-domain concept. You know, and to provide our national leaders multiple options while presenting our adversaries multiple dilemmas, working with multiple partners, operating in multiple domains. So I think simplistically, for all the soldiers and old soldiers in here, it's, you know, overlapping and interlocking fields of fire and cover your dead space. We're doing that on steroids in multi-domain operations. It's covering all the domains, including electromagnetic spectrum, cyber, information, air, land, and sea, and space, and doing that with, again, multiple partners. A key word that General Brito said was complementary. I think we're looking more at complementary effects across those domains. And to do that, the other key word that both Generals Gayler and Brito have mentioned is integration, is integrating instead of being coordinated or synchronized in time and space.
Yeah, I would add, multi-domain operations is inherently joint. We fight as a joint force, and we got to remember that. This takes time to train it, understand it, and integrate it in a theater. And oh, by the way, when you're in a combined environment, you got to bring those folks along. So when you look at the overall concept, I think what we've got to be prepared to do is understand what the operational environment is today. Russia and China has spent the last 25 years figuring out how we operate and how they can fracture air-land battle. They've developed systems and technologies to do that. So where are the options that must be created to give the commander the right options to be able to deter and defeat a potential enemy? I think Army formations, as we think about the future, have got to possess the necessary capacity, capability, and endurance to operate across multiple domains. We need to simplify our vernacular and quit using big words and get it down so it's understandable down to the lowest level. At the end of the day, fights are won or lost at platoon, company, squad level. And we got to, in my opinion, neck this down so folks understand what we're talking about. And if you look at our congressional leaders, I'm not sure they understand that when you're trying to fund a particular type of capability. The other thing I would tell you is technology may not be enough to defeat deter, fight, and win, because the force must be tough, fit, resilient, and determined. I'm impressed with what you're trying to do at basic training to get the warfighting mentality back in the force. And one last point on this. We must be prepared to operate more at echelon. And now, what am I talking about? Theater level. How do you set a theater for success in a rapid fashion? Army level. When you look at our field armies, because they play an essential part, you take Central Command and what they do with 3rd United States Army. And then what Army Corps do. One thing in Corps, in my mind, we have left out reconnaissance and security at Corps level. You must gain and maintain contact with the enemy. That is not going to go away. So you've got expanded battle space. You got to think about that and what that means. And the other thing is how you reintegrate divisions and corps fires and targeting cells. Because I agree with long-range fires. It starts with fires and how you set conditions if you want to create multiple options and multiple dilemmas. And lastly are BCTs, how all that's integrated. So I think that's going to take a lot of training and understanding of this concept, and we got to get it into dirt and we got to practice it.
If I could just add on to that, so just going back to your initial point, so it is inherently joint. Multi-domain operations is inherently joint, and as General Thurman was remarking, that you got to be able to train and understand and integrate multi-domain capabilities or cross-domain capabilities. Which, for those of you who didn't know, there was an Army targeting center, let alone an Army multi-domain targeting center. This is part of the reason back in 2014 that General Mangum as the TRADOC DCG looked at standing up, because what we're currently in the process of doing, not just at the Army Multi-Domain Targeting Center, but as part of the larger Fire Center of Excellence portfolio, is to train, certify, and qualify individuals and crews to be able to target for cross-domain capabilities. We're very proficient in targeting for organic assets, but at the national and theater level ISR, when it comes to pre-planned joint airspace, when it comes to the space, electronic warfare, offensive cyber capabilities, where the authority resides at a very high level. These are the things that we don't target for. And going back into setting the theater, this is something that should be going on, and currently within the larger DoD targeting enterprise is going on every single week. And this is the piece that come January we'll begin to provide an Army pipeline so that at the theater level, at the corps level, and potentially at the division level, they can not only target for these cross-domain assets, but be trained and certified along with our joint, along with our multinational partners, to be able to integrate these capabilities within time and space and at range. And when I mean at range, well beyond the FISL. Well beyond the FISL. Where the biggest benefit to the BCT will be that division or that corps or that field army will have shaped that battlefield to a point of significant overmatch in favor of the BCT when that close fight does occur. Thank you.
Well, let's go back to the Maneuver Center. Sir, I think you have one or two questions there.
I do. The first one, call the button again. The question is, the current TRADOC commanders emphasizing the role megacities will play in multi-domain operations. Doesn't that environment negate or diminish U.S. technology and leadership? I would argue actually no. And here's a thought. In understanding megacities being possibly one of the characteristics or components of the future operational environment, older technology may be challenged. I feel comfortable in the decentralized operations that we're challenging our leaders, younger leaders and soldiers to operating as well, that the leadership will be effective in that type of city. To link to General Thurman's comment as well, clearly changes the dynamic in the way that we may train platoons, companies, and battalions with the BCT, because they're going to win the fight that last 100 yards. But what I would suggest or offer up in the name of technology given this new characteristic or a characteristic of dense urban terrain or megacities, it illustrates the capabilities that may be required or are required to operate in this environment. And to hook this to something that was talked to earlier in the efforts with soldier lethality, no doubt industry and others will offer the capabilities we need, but improvements with night vision goggles, improvements with the type of radios that can operate line of sight or in the dense urban environment or megacities that allow the soldiers to talk to each other. And so I would also suggest that this lends in very well to what multi-domain operations is demanding in integrating all the warfighting functions together. And a simple example, and Bill talked to this earlier, the necessity for very well integrated sensor-to-shooter capabilities between the aviation that may be afar, several kilometers away, supporting the maneuver element on the ground is a necessity. The necessity for precision missiles, or precision indirect fire, precision mortars, both at the maneuver level or from the fires that may be supporting them, very much necessary. I know all that is being worked on now as well to limit collateral damage. And for sure working with the joint force. So what it really demands, in my opinion, sir, is the integration across all the domains and how all of that needs to change, all that needs to be considered as we plan, think, and work through our operations. All the technologies may be challenged, but the fact that the understanding the operational environment, which is very much part of the MDO, has caused us to look at technologies, training, and simple leadership that'll make us effective in this. Clearly an opportunity. And the 6 priorities that we talked to earlier, 6 modernization priorities, integrated together, are all getting at those threats, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would add too, when you think in terms of the U.S. leadership, I think our philosophy or our ability to execute mission command off of mission type orders, to have subordinate elements understand task and purpose, to operate somewhat independently as long as they're following commander intent. I would say that we currently train, and our philosophy lends very well to a dense urban terrain, probably more so than anybody else.
I would add another facet to megacities, and it was one of the things I was faced with in Korea. Unclass-wise, 4,000 to 6,000 underground facilities. That requires soldiers that can get in and exploit. This is a different kind of thinking. When you look at the quality of facilities that are in North Korea, as an example. So we've got to invest energy in how, once we get a force on the ground, of how you're going to rapidly exploit. That's a big problem. And I think for megacity operations, we're going to have to spend time, money, and effort for subterranean type facilities to train this force. You're going to be faced with that in the future. And, I was amazed inside of Baghdad, the number of underground facilities that they had, Saddam had over there. Very good, hardened. And so we got to think about that. And that's going to require a little bit different thing. So you got to move a force in there, and you got to have a sufficient communications network after you've set conditions with long-range fires and reconnaissance operations, so you can defeat an enemy force. So I think this is going to require a little bit different level of training and thinking for the future when we get into this megacity business. And so it's just something that I'll throw out there that you need to be thinking about.
Let's go back to the Aviation Center of Excellence here. Bill, I think you've got 3 questions stacked up there. Pick one and...
Yes, sir. So the question was, what are challenges of training and standardization of technologies, Link 16, MUM-T, that are not widely utilized in the current fight? And then what are the strategies for training multi-domain? So I would tell you, challenge is frankly one of scale. So when you have, General Munt kind of alluded to it, when you have 2,135 Blackhawks, 767 Apaches, and 542 Chinooks in our fleet, and you're going to try to integrate some technology, well, just from simple Moore's law that, before you even field the first unit, certain technologies are obsolete. So why do you spend so much, why do you want to field and replace entire fleets of stuff? The key is how do you have capabilities that are easy to train, that at a certain time you can insert technology, get a quick validation on it, and take it to combat. I would tell you probably the single greatest opportunity we have in that arena is in the STE, the synthetic training environment. That is thinking differently about how we train in a virtual and constructive world that complements live training, but you can rapidly upgrade and integrate new technologies that allow you to transition straight to a platform, be it a vehicle or an aircraft or an artillery system, et cetera, and quickly place it into operation already trained in a synthetic training environment. That is probably our single greatest opportunity to overcome the challenge of scale, in my opinion. And I'll yield to anyone else that wants to tag onto that.
Sir, if I could just add on, in addition to the scale, is also the speed at the operational level that warfare actually occurs now in a multi-domain environment, which right now we are leveraging, even at the Fire Center of Excellence, as far as from a synthetic environment to be able to do the experimentation. And what I mean by that is, as far as how we're prosecuting warfare at the operational level, we as an Army, is that the joint targeting process and integrating mechanism, it's something that we haven't done before in the past, but we're looking at to be an instrumental part when you talk about long-range precision fires, when you talk about the actual force, the fire's force structure, to be able to support multi-domain maneuver, that it's got to be able to function very differently than what we've observed and trained and exercised, even for a theater warfighter in the past. So I'd say the speed and how do you maintain a persistent attack against the enemy, not in terms of cycles of plan, prepare, execute, but a persistent attack where the enemy doesn't get a breath and doesn't know from which domain the enemy is going to get attacked from next. And that's really at the crux of the types of formations as well as the weapon systems that the Fire Center of Excellence is looking at, and particularly to integrate all these weapon systems for current technologies and future technologies, not just within the Army, but across the force, across the services. The joint targeting process and having trained certified personnel, which we haven't had in the past, will be an instrumental part of being able to exercise moving forward. Thank you.
Let's go back to the maneuver center of the Aviation Center of Excellence here. I think we're stacking questions up for you, Bill. There.
You want to take turns?
We'll get you promoted.
Yeah. So someone stated that, hey, Lieutenant General Lundy stated his goal to fly and fight in 0-0. What's being done on the ground and air side in weapons and sensor development? So first off, good strategy is to agree with your boss. I agree with General Lundy. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. No, so there has been a good deal of work done in degraded visual environments to understand and how to operate. I do firmly believe that any future capability that we bring into the Army needs to have that capability to not just operate but fight in that environment. But we also have to be pragmatic about where does it fall in the current priorities and what can you afford to do and where's the technology right now and how much can you invest in it to accelerate it or not accelerate it and just incorporate it into the next armed reconnaissance aircraft or long-range assault aircraft. So I would tell you we are certainly very interested in it, and when affordable, we will certainly continue to pursue it and absolutely intend to wrap that capability into any future aircraft. And I assume the same for other systems. Anyone else?
So another question, a little bit of shift of focus, and the topic is on cyber and space integration. Question reads, how do we integrate the effects of cyber and space with the maneuver force? Question one, down to what echelon should we enable maneuver commanders with cyber capability and authorities? That's actually a pretty tough one. I'm going to take a little risk, and to illustrate this, look at the combat training centers and back it up from there. At both CTs and most recently experience with JRTC, and to hook this to one of General Thurman's comments as well, is training at echelon. And again, looking at the brigade combat team as that element that may be doing the combat, does he or she or does that command not necessarily have the authority delegated down to him to access space and cyber capabilities, but access to that authority to the next level echelon? Of course, at the CTCs, there's no division there, although division tech may be set up, but the ops group is playing that division headquarters. So that BCT commander, probably no lower than that, has access to tap those authorities to enable him to benefit from the capabilities of cyber and space. I can say, again, talking to our boss, Lieutenant General Lundy, as we're writing the echelon above brigade doctrine now, that is one of the things that are being considered. It's too easy to say, yes, give the BCT commander the authority to access all cyber and space assets. I would probably not recommend that now, but perhaps nested to the division, and of course, as the big global asset, big global capability, can that BCT or division commander access and use the assets or the effects of cyber and electronic warfare, correcting cyber and space? Everybody wants it, probably not enough of it, but we definitely need to manage and probably flatline fires as well, integrated with that as well, and manage the accessibility to use those assets down in the authorities. Of course, some of our current laws affect that. Nesting at all echelon, or nesting with all the domains affects that. And prioritizing, just like we would fires, access to cyber and space authorities as well. One thing I can say that's very effective and somewhat old school, perhaps is having a proper liaison down at the brigade and division level that can help you manage and talk to those assets that will give this capability to the warfighter. And I'll yield to any of my battle buddies.
I would just say, as you think about what General Brito just kind of talked about, and think about the complexity of how you would train that and set conditions, and that's going to be required again at echelon. And so I believe we've got to get back to more in-depth level of training for our corps and our Army level folks. And if you look at how we go to war today, we cobble structure together. That's what we did for 1003 Victor. I happened to be on the scene for that. And that was high adventure because we cobbled together a team at the last minute. And we're trying to figure out how we're going to orchestrate an attack into Iraq with two corps, you know, the 5th U.S. Corps, the 1 MEF, and the 1st UK Division. Now, let me tell you, that's high adventure because guess what we had to put on top of that? A joint communications system that, oh, by the way, was not necessarily compatible at every level. And so that's why I think when you back up and look at multi-domain operations, expanded battlefield, and what this means across all these domains, this is a tall order for us that we got to really kind of think through and make sure that we've got the resident joint command and control systems that, oh, by the way, that brings these combined partners and our allies in the network. And so as you think about that, this is going to take a lot of work for us. And so, you know, if we're going to fight a Russia or a China, which we could potentially do that, that's what we need to be organized for. So I think for aviation, we've definitely got to be integrated in this now to do the things that we've got to be able to do, and particularly looking at our mission command systems to make sure that we can, no kidding, be agile. We have the necessary mobility and can move combat power in a decisive manner on the battlefield. That's what this is going to require.
As we talk area denial, spectrum denial will be a huge issue for us. And just thinking about it, thinking through it, down to soldier, leader, commander level, what are the tactics, techniques, and procedures that are going to be necessary to overcome that, along with the technology? So this is not just a material solution, but it's getting back to knitting and operating in an environment where the spectrum will be denied in a way that it never has been before.
Colonel Gwon, I think you have several questions down there that you can take on right now.
Thank you, sir. So I've got a question from General Swanton. USAPAC recently integrated long-range fires into their maritime domain during RIMPAC 2018. Is there a true need there, or is the U.S. Army searching for justification for the long-range precision fires modernization effort?
Let's see how you answer.
Well, so I would say yes, to an extent. USAPAC did integrate long-range fires. Did they target for those long-range fires? Did they develop targets for those long-range fires? Were those long-range fires actually part of the overall joint fight for PACOM as it comes to penetrating and disintegrating the A2AD network that we are fully aware of and have identified in multi-domain operations 1.5 that both the Chinese and the Russians are capable of pushing forward? And I think the answer to that question would be no. So long-range precision fires, beyond just the cross-functional team, goes beyond just a single event, if you will, executing a single multi-domain event, a single cross-domain event. When you start talking about multi-domain operations, it's tying in those long-range precision fires into an overall collective, combined, joint, multinational fight to persistently engage the enemy across different domains, both in terms of maneuver as well as fires. And that's the piece here that when we talk about building capacity with the current force to be able to do that, to be able to not just target for long-range fires, but also target for the full complement of capabilities that are resident within PACOM, accessible to PACOM, and support of PACOM. And then being able to integrate that's sir, we're not quite there yet. But I would say that USAPAC is at the forefront of us building that capacity so that they can begin tying in what they're currently doing now into the larger fight, if you will. The long-range fire is also, sir, is not just the lethal aspect, it's also the non-lethal aspect. And going back, when you think about greatest potential as far as development of fires, it's actually in the non-lethal, not in the lethal. And what I mean by that, when you talk about the ranges that we're experimenting with, that we're looking at, as far as standoff, as far as at what point do you employ a maneuver BCT, it's the cyber potential offensive cyber and offensive space that provides the greatest potential as far as if you're looking at these extended ranges. Those are probably going to be your primary weapon systems. I mean, we are also building material solutions, not just the LRPF CFT, but also there's also work being done in hypersonics. But going back to do what, right? And so, Brito brought up a good point. Particularly for cyber assets, it's a finite number of assets that has almost an infinite number of possibilities as far as effects it can achieve. And so, as far as enabling a BCT with these assets, the BCT probably doesn't have the staff to be able to get these assets, to be able to target for these assets. And when it comes to actually getting the BCT access, this is where, at the division, at echelons above brigade, they've got to identify to do what and to be able to compete for these assets moving forward. Because there is also work, not as well publicized, but there's also work being done in terms of the non-lethal fires as far as being almost, the main effort or the leading effort in terms of shaping ops. Thank you.
On the Army relevance piece of the question, which is a good one and is asked often, while General Perkins did kind of bring together this multi-domain battle concept, one of the first big proponents for it was Admiral Harry Harris. And certainly you can ask Tony Crutchfield at the break about that proponency of being able to use all the tools in his kit bag to engage targets cross domain. So while the Army needs to look at multi-domain operations as a joint fight, so do the other services and combatant commanders. And I think together everybody's moving in step to do that.
Let's go back to Aviation Center Commander. I think you've got a stack of questions there that you're working through, Bill.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So I'm going to group a couple of questions together here. So just a tip for the audience, if you fill up every line in the card with a 17-part question, probably not going to answer all of them. But so basically, to paraphrase, hey, how do you envision operating in order to disintegrate? And another member in the audience asked, the Army and Air Force have largely freely operated in a permissive environment during a coin fight, counterinsurgency fight. What are your thoughts on how will we operate with temporary freedom of maneuver in the air domain, and then how do we gain freedom of maneuver in the air domain? So I'll kind of sort of lump those two big cards together. So to kind of echo General Thurman, first off, any fight in the future will absolutely be a joint fight. This is not an Army problem to solve. This is largely not just a U.S. Department of Defense problem to solve, because the likelihood is also there that we will always have partners, allies, coalition members that will fight with us. So our challenge becomes one of interoperability and synchronization that we've got to continue to master. So in that is training requirements, in that is leader development requirements, et cetera, organizational design, all of it. But when you think of how will we get windows of temporary dominance, we envision this in a very unclassified form. We envision this being multifaceted, and it's also how do you gain an advantage over an adversary cognitively, temporally, and physically? How do we plan cyber and EW effects to take maximum advantage of their capabilities? How do we integrate the joint force, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, its capabilities with the U.S. Army, with our coalition members to establish a position of dominance? I would tell you, so if you have deterrence fail and you must then penetrate to disintegrate, to exploit, first thing you have to do is to identify a point of vulnerability, to isolate at a point of penetration. So back to kind of my earlier comments, you have to detect it, detect the vulnerability, identify, locate, share it with everybody, not just Army, but everybody. The U.S. Army does have a huge training requirement to regain skills, probably a DOD requirement, to regain skills of how do you build strike packages that account for needs of services at the point and time they need it. So when we isolate something to penetrate it, we need the joint force aiding in the isolation of that point of vulnerability, not just the Army. But I do think that it is certainly possible, and the way we think, we tend to think of establishing dominance in the physical world. We've got to unconstrain our thinking and also understand temporally for a limited period of time and cognitively to get an effect on a point of vulnerability at the time we choose. And it may be cyber, it may be space, it may be EW, it may be fixed wing, it may be rotary wing, it may be paratroopers, it may, we have multiple options. But it's also how we bring in technology. How do we envision using unmanned systems? Well, in multiple ways. So, I would envision swarming capabilities that have EW capacities on board that can jam, spoof, clutter, deny their integrated fires complex or their integrated air defense network. Then it does no good if you temporarily deny or degrade something without taking advantage of it. So you have to have shooters and maneuver elements capable of taking advantage of that, exploiting it to further disintegrate that capability. And I will defer to other panel members for any additional comments.
Hey, Bill, thanks. I think you illustrated a very good point, or highlighted a very good point of this. As we work into MDO, the importance of thinking and planning with all 6 domains. And it's not just an evolution to how we may do MDMP at all echelons. At a broader scale, understanding, planning, and implementing the effects of, say, cyber to mitigate the threats that come with area access and area denial is an example. At a much lower level, to link in, say, the brigade combat team and the aviation that may support it, the sense of the shooter capabilities of the rewards that the aircraft can offer us as well, the ability to see and communicate in, say, a dense urban terrain to enable the maneuver at that last 100 yards is, again, but another example. So I would suggest, and I know our boss at Leavenworth is working this, one of our bosses at Leavenworth is working this, is a reshaping of the way we train our soldiers and leaders to think, to plan, to implement MDMP, and change our doctrine, quite frankly, so that we enable all the assets of these 6 domains, sir. And I'll yield.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things about training is for our commanders. We used to talk a lot about commander's intent for fires. And that's the visualization of how you want fires to complement the success of your maneuver. So maybe we go back and we have commander's intent for fire, cyber, what we need to worry about in electromagnetic spectrum. Because even today in some theaters it's contested today. It's denied. And then commander's intent for what you want with space assets. One of the things, my favorite thing in my last job was to go around and find out what the space officer's doing. That's on the staff. Guess what he's doing? Night battle captain or something other than what he ought to be doing. Well, that's my fault because I hadn't set the conditions. And so, again, I think when we talk about agile thinking, multiple dilemmas, forcing an adversary to fight in multiple directions, we got to get back to this because this is a thinking sport. War fighting's not for amateurs, and especially with this multi-domain business that we're into today. So as you go across these domains, that's something maybe we re-energize for the force. The other thing is Army training. Let me tell you about Army training budgets. It's 12 to 13% every year. I don't care how you cut it in the Pentagon. Despite the best arguments in the world, that's how much goes to Army training. So this is going to require more time and effort from the joint community in my mind. That's why exercises, particularly if you're building partnership and alliances and strengthening alliances, we have to train this business.
And we also need to build interoperability into platforms to be able to operate with, again, multiple partners. I think that's something that we haven't done as well as we could have or should have in the past few years. And looking forward, if we're going to be reliant on international partners, we need to build that interoperability into our kit.
Which brings up, sir, just another challenge that we have for leaders and as well as for soldiers is just understanding what the multi-domain capabilities are. We're very well versed, again, in Army organic assets and what the Army can employ. Where we fall short in order for commanders to be able to express that intent is not just having an LNO, but actually tying in either through, PME or a functional course. What are the other capabilities that we want our commanders to think about, particularly, on the non-lethal side? And I think as far as where authorities line up, that's where there's a lot of confusion, because a BCT commander may get told you're going to have X number of cyber capabilities, but those authorities don't necessarily come with it, let alone understanding exactly what that capability can do in terms of for employment, as well as the effect in terms of understanding the target or targets that that commander is trying to prosecute, to understand how to tie those assets in correctly, and then put out an intent to the staff as far as working into a cohesive plan.
Bill, I think we're back to your stack here. You're getting
sir.
pretty low.
I think I have one. It was either a write-in from Thomas Todd or from Doug Gabram. They wish that I tell everybody all from the Huntsville live feed to please get back to work. No, okay. So we actually had a question of what options in the Army, or is the Army considering for aviation assets at Corps, Division, and Brigade, and what should it consider? So I think so it's considering all options. I mean, frankly, as we continue to study and analyze where we can bring in capability that best suits a potential future fight, you have to kind of have everything on the table. Nothing's off the table. But I think also you gotta figure out what it is you're trying to do with them. So if you're a Corps commander today and you want to shape or set conditions for a subordinate division, you actually have to take from subordinate divisions in terms of intel, fires, and aviation to set conditions back for that division. So, it becomes one of, and then, oh, by the way, the division still has to set conditions further for BCTs, et cetera. So we know that there is a need at echelons above brigade and division to have capabilities to set and shape the battlefield for subordinate elements. That includes not only aviation, but also fires and collection, et cetera, that helps set those conditions. So I think everything's on the table. But when you look at timing and churn on the force, or stress on the force, op tempo, for example, so aviation force right now is about 84% committed every day. So if we were to introduce a new armed reconnaissance squadron today, you would have to take down a current squadron to then refield new equipment, train, et cetera, to build it back up. So you would take one out of the available pool and for about a year, and the op tempo on the remaining ones would go even higher. So a strategy for minimizing churn while introducing capability becomes one of, hey, the timing also is right that we try to get capability into a core. So maybe the strategy is time the core capability with the on-ramping of a new aircraft. You stand it up at the core without touching the divisional cabs right now so that the churn and turbulence and op tempo don't go up. You bring in that capability, and then over time you then cascade down to solve that problem. But again, you got to ask what's its purpose and what's it for. We're not trying to put capability back into a core just to put a capability back into a core. There's a requirement for shaping a battlefield for continuous reconnaissance and security to gain understanding through the development of combat information to enable a commander's decision, and that is an active process. That is not something that just happens. You have to fight for information. You have to fight to cause the enemy to show something rather than just watching it from above. And then you have to very specifically target those points of vulnerability to enable the entire joint force to exploit. And I'll yield.
Hey, Bill, I may add, and you may recall a writing session we had about a month and a half ago on this new multi-domain doctrine, and a little emphasis on the Army as part of a joint force. And at a much higher echelon, perhaps the effects we're looking for in aviation assets at a time could be from another element that's supporting the joint force, although the Army's working with it. At this level, 100% agree there's not enough peanut butter to spread around for everybody who may want it at corps, division, and especially brigade level. But leveraging the temporary effects from other assets may help us get to the same end state as well. Over.
You know, in Korea, I told the United States Marine Corps, I said, once you enter this theater, those assets that come in here, I'm going to help prioritize those. You got any problem with that?
Let me guess what they say.
You know, the whole point is we got to take every tool in the kit, and it's got to be integrated. So when you look at what the concept, I like the fact that your new version of this lays this out better with the work that the Army's done. Compete, penetrate, disintegrate, exploit, and recompete. And understanding where we fit in that role as aviation, part of this overall combined arms maneuver piece. And so I think the thinking and the energy that's going in that is right. So you've got a task organized for success, and you got to go back and look at your organizations. I do believe you have to look hard at these organizations and where you got aviation, and to really make combined arms maneuver more effective, because I think that's what's required when you look at this concept, you know, from the ability to move small units rapidly across expanded battle space. We're talking about greater distances, particularly if you're talking about an Eastern European type scenario against a Russian threat. So I think what we've got to do, the next level, is really operationalize this and then look at these organizations, because it takes a while in the Army to build force structure. You don't build that overnight, and it's competing against something else. Every person's important in the force structure business. So, and it's costly. And so it's just something you got to think about.
A key piece of this, obviously, as General Gayler said, that Army Aviation being 84% committed every day. There's a number of us in this room that have struggled with how do you get the best bang for the buck out of aviation. And I like the track that General Gayler and team are on to better organize it, to get after that echelon above division. The other piece, quite frankly, is that we've got to do a better job on figuring out how do we resource, leverage, and employ our Compo 2 and Compo 3 aviation capability. Because, you know, fly it early, fly it often, and really lean on them.
Let's go back to the Aviation Center. He's almost down to the bottom.
Okay, I think, yeah, I'm down to last couple. So does the multi-domain operations require a new attack helicopter to replace the H-64 as the armed reconnaissance aircraft replaces the 58 and the long range replaces the UH-60? So I would say, I wouldn't say, first off, that the armed reconnaissance is replacing an OH-58 because there is no OH-58 in our inventory today. So what that armed reconnaissance aircraft is designed to do is to replace an AH-64 used as a reconnaissance and security platform in a HARS, an armed reconnaissance squadron. That airframe was not designed to do that. Therefore, that's why we're pursuing something that does it optimized for that mission. But does it mean that you now have to have a replacement for the H-64? I mean, I would say somewhere in the future, absolutely. 64s will no longer be in the inventory, just like Hueys are no longer in the inventory. It's inevitable. They have a lifespan. But the timing of what replaces it and the affordability of when it's replaced is yet to be seen. Right now, it's an incredibly capable aircraft that we know we're going to be flying well into the 40s. That will still be an incredibly capable aircraft, even made more capable by the armed reconnaissance aircraft that complements it and the long-range assault aircraft that further enable it to be successful. But I would tell you, are we looking right now today at drawing something up? No, but we know there will be a time when we have to do that. But we're, again, being somewhat pragmatic about, you know, what you can afford to do and prioritize where you have greatest need. Right now, the ARA and the long-range assault are a higher priority because that Apache is still very, very capable.
Back to the fires. Colonel Gwon, did you have any other question down there, or did you?
I did, sir. I had one about readdressing the backbone network architecture, about why the Army is not looking more closely at Link 16. Our sister services and joint brethren use it now, and we can't talk to them except in 88 battalions. Why invent something new that will leapfrog over them when we find ourselves in the same position? Not being a network specialist, I will say this, that the fires network that is being developed is supposed to be hardened, be able to function in a GPS-denied environment. It's supposed to be redundant. And if that's Link 16 and it fits the bill, I'm not aware that Link 16 is not being considered as part of one of those networks. Then I had a second question about the U.S. Air Force and Navy have focused on extensive exploitation of space assets. Can you discuss the Army vision to exploit the space domain? I will say, having visited the Air Force Targeting Center, the 363rd ISR Wing, and seeing that the work that they have been doing when it comes to exploiting cyber as well as space, I would say it's in the area of target development and understanding more so from the threat standpoint, understanding the threat to a degree as far as a very high level of precision and accuracy when it comes to the actual employment of space and cyber assets in terms of achieving a window of superiority in that respective domain. It's always going to be contested, space and cyber. The issue is then how do you then create those windows of superiority, of which this is also something that will be coming online with in FY19 for the Army to be able to increase our understanding within the command post as far as the threat space vulnerabilities, cyber vulnerabilities. And then to that extent, we'll be working that with our joint partners, our multinational partners, and then looking at collectively as part of the joint fight. And based upon the intent of the Joint Force Commander, determine what the deployment of those capabilities in the sequence will be. Thank you.
It looks like we're about down to the last 10 minutes. Bill, I think you have one last question there, and then we could get any last comments and wrap this up.
Thanks, sir. So my last question is, how do you envision training all compos to the required crew and unit standards for multi-domain maneuver operations, especially to be expeditionary against the near-peer adversary? And then what do you see the biggest challenge to implement that as? Oh, thank you. Got another. Make max use of the last 11 minutes and 5 seconds. I think, I think it's good that the Army's looking at an objective way to measure training readiness, frankly. And I think, subjectively saying we're trained in a certain task without fully training collectively is not painting the correct picture to people that resource the Army or to elements inside the Army that have a false sense of readiness. So I think any move to Objective T is good, because then you can truly measure, regardless of compo, where their training status is based on where they're resourced and how many collective events they've done to achieve that readiness. So I think Objective T and how we measure readiness is critical. I think we have to keep a very close eye on where we're resourced to. If you're an active component crew, you receive 10.6 hours per month funding. If you're in the Compo 2 and 3, it's significantly less, but logically because of available training periods, et cetera. And whenever we reach into a Compo 2 or 3 unit, there's a train-up period with additional resources to get them to a collective level of readiness. So I think the key is to ensure that we adequately and effectively communicate our current resourcing level to our current readiness level. And I think we do ourselves a disservice anytime we are funded to a certain level, under-execute for multiple reasons, because aircraft not on hand, crews not on hand, we flew it, but it was in a different pot of money because they deployed unforecasted. But if we fly less and we still call ourselves trained, that's doing a disservice to us, frankly, because the Army will resource you at a lesser level, and it does not take a rocket scientist to see that, there will be a time when that increases risk significantly, in my opinion.
Yeah. Let me just say something here to your point, Bill. We got to quit apologizing about how expensive aviation is. It's essential for the future battlefield if you want to do multi-domain operations. The Air Force doesn't apologize. The Navy doesn't apologize. So don't apologize. You got to go forward, put the bill on the table, and you got to have the analytical data to back it up. That's what happens in the Pentagon. And you got to fight for it. And all these 6 priorities that the chief's laid out, we need to get behind the chief, and we need to pile on. That's the real deal. But we can't be trying to rob Peter to pay Paul. If we don't modernize this force, we're going to lose the next fight. It's simple as that. When you look at what the Russians are doing and what the Chinese are doing. In my mind, the Chinese are number 1 right now. So don't apologize. And just continue to move forward with this. You've got a concept. Now we got to move forward with how we want this concept to be operationalized.
And sir, and Bill, if I may add, Bill, everything you said, 100% obviously spot on, and I think it could be expanded to all the skill sets that are part of the maneuver force. Right. Whether the Army, Infantry, Artillery, the whole bit. This is clearly one area worked on the Objective T, where I'm proud to say there's 0 daylight between the two ACOMs of Force Common Trade-Off. working together in their training plans to enable this level of readiness. Objective T, an integrated weapons training strategy for the commander to focus all his assets to give that objective, real, I'm ready to fight tonight assessment, based and hooked to General Thurman's comments as well.
And the biggest challenge, I think, is leveraging both General Thurman and General Gayler's comments is resourcing. General Ham said straight up this morning that aviation is 25% of the Army budget, training and sustainment. That's just a fact of life. But how we best use that budget, and back to the question on how do we better leverage all compos and aviation, it goes to resourcing. How do we resource them to fly them early and often? And that really becomes the challenge. The question that General Thurman asked earlier today about AH-64 pilot shortages, aviation is the only branch that is the number of TRADOC seats is limited by budget. For every other branch, we determine how many seats are required and fund it. Aviation, its seats is based on funding available. So that's how we get into these holes where we are. So don't apologize, but we got to use that 25% of the Army budget as effectively and efficiently as we can.
Might have time for one last question here that I'll read so every member that might have something to say can address it. Future vertical lift platforms will need to detect, ID, locate, and share information on advanced targets at standoff range. Do you see these capabilities being organic to the platform, or will we continue to rely heavily on unmanned assets which currently are not survivable?
So I think short answer is yes and no. We do envision a large portion of those capabilities to be on board and also on an unmanned system. I think you also have to plan in some redundancy on the battlefield anyway. You can't have one sensor be multitask and then lose the sensor. Now you have nothing. So I do think there's a component of both, frankly. I think also there is when we talk about unmanned systems in the future and advanced unmanned systems, there's an element of greater survivability on those platforms as well. This is not our current unmanned systems with just a new thing put on it. So they would also be more survivable, but I'll yield.
Yeah, Bill, and we talked about this in another forum, all those systems integrated and interoperable with other network systems that the Army has so that they truly complement the effects that a future vertical lift may do, the integration and ability to communicate, sensitive shooter with the guy on the ground, and other systems as well. Over.
We're not building stuff anymore. We're building and integrating capabilities. So when we did the Big Five for airland battle, it was 5 platforms. So the Big 6 now are the 6 capability sets that are being developed for multi-domain operations are just that. They are capability sets and not necessarily platform-centric, and they're being integrated from the outset. So it goes to a totally different mindset of focusing on capabilities and how we integrate those capabilities to achieve effects in a complementary fashion, overlapping and interlocking fields of fire, covering dead space in multiple domains.
And sir, just to add on, just given the finite number of detection assets at the theater and national level for a particular theater, I would say almost that these detection assets for the Army, as far as what land forces bring to the overall joint multi-domain fight, are going to be absolutely critical to make sure that land forces can at range detect, identify, locate, as well as target, and then of course be a part of an integrated complementary network. Over.
Yeah, I would just say we need to go back and look at the fundamentals of reconnaissance and what our reconnaissance objectives are. You know, we've had good doctrine over the past years. And I think we can bring a lot of this stuff forward in terms of what our reconnaissance objectives are and how you prioritize assets on the battlefield. That's what it's all about. You don't have enough flashlights, okay? You know, you don't have enough. And that's the real deal. So this is going to require more agile thinking, especially when you look at expanded battle space. And that's something that we need to be thinking about. That's my last comment.
I want to thank the entire panel, and Guy, I give back 1 minute and 34 seconds to the other panels for their use.